Dimensions of the Daf with Rabbi Mordechai Becher on JBS is made possible in part by the B.L. Manger Foundation in memory of Ben Manger.
Hi, I am Mordechai Becher and welcome to Jewish Broadcasting Service, Dimensions of the Daf, in which we explore different aspects of what the Talmud says about pretty much every subject under the sun. Okay, so let me start with bread. Let's get this bread. So the first mention of bread ever in Torah and ever in history is Genesis 3 verse 18, in which God tells Adam, after the sin of Adam and Eve, God says, "B'zeyat apecha tochal lechem." You will eat bread by the sweat of your brow. You will eat bread, literally it says, the sweat of your face, but usually this is the part that sweats, the brow, the forehead. In any case, it says, you'll eat bread by the sweat of your brow. Interesting. And until that time, Adam and Eve were eating of the fruit of the trees of the Garden of Eden. Fruit readily available, pluck it off the tree, peel it, wash it, eat it, no big deal, no preparation necessary. God tells Adam and Eve, after the sin, now you will eat from the herbs, the grass of the field. And he says, you will eat bread, but to make bread, you've really got to work hard. You know, there's the harvesting, there is the plowing, the planting, the covering of the seeds, the harvesting, the making of sheaves, the gathering in of the sheaves. There is the threshing to remove the stalks, to remove the wheat from the stalks. There is the winnowing to remove the husk from the wheat. There is the selecting to remove all the little rocks and everything else and the pieces of garbage, etc. Then there's the grinding to turn into flour. And then once it's flour, you've got to mix it with water and other stuff and knead it and let it rise. Then you have to bake it. There's a lot of stuff involved in making bread. I know that children think that bread grows on the supermarket shelf, but as we all know, it is not so simple. So God tells Adam that by the sweat of your brow you'll eat bread. And by the way, bread is not just a food that is significant in the Torah, in Jewish tradition, but bread is something which people all over the world eat bread. I mean, there's chapati, and there's naan, and there's roti, and there is tortilla, and there are baguettes and bagels, and a huge range of different types of bread, which are literally eaten all over the planet. Bread is type of, as it's called, the staff of life. It is one of the most central foods in human society, and certainly in Jewish tradition, we will see that it's quite central. So the first mention is Adam, who is told that by the sweat of his brow he will eat bread. It won't be readily accessible like fruit of the tree. He'll have to work, process it, refine it, etc., etc. Then it is also crops up at the end of the Torah, Deuteronomy 8, where the Torah, we are told that God says that you Jews you'll come into the land of Israel. Before you come to the land of Israel, in the desert, God says, I will give you manna, which is bread that comes out of heaven. And he says, but the reason I'm giving you man, this bread coming from heaven, is in order that you should know, and I'll read you, it says, Vayancha vayareveka vayachilcha taman. He humbled you, let you hunger, and fed you with manna. Asher lo yadata v'lo yadun avotecha, that you and your parents had no knowledge of such a thing as man, this bread dropping out of heaven. He says, why? So the Torah says, why did God give the Jews man in the desert? I mean, already, if it's a miracle, so a miracle can be done, not that I've done miracles, but I'm imagining that God could do the miracle any number of ways. It doesn't have to be bread dropping out of heaven. It could be miraculously that the desert sprouts. You know, Entenmann cakes come up out of the sand. Not very nutritious, but still, I mean, it doesn't have to be coming. So why is the bread coming out of heaven? So the Torah gives us a very interesting reason. It says this, Lama'an hodiacha, in order to inform you, and this is one of the most famous verses in the Torah, It says, Ki lo ala lechem levado yichyeh ha'adam, not by bread alone does man live, Ki al kol motza pi Hashem yichyeh ha'adam, but by all that proceeds from God's mouth does the human live. In other words, what the Torah is saying is, don't think that life depends only on the material and on the physical sustenance. In order to live, you need God's blessing, you need God's will, you need God's desire that you should live. It is not by bread alone. It's a way of saying, even though bread is central, even though bread is sustaining, even though bread is nutritious, I assume if it's whole wheat, but even though bread has all these qualities and it is a quintessentially human food, and we'll discuss why that is so soon, but God wanted to show us that it's not just by bread that we live. Yes, you need physical sustenance, but humans need more than the material world. We need more than physical substance. In the immortal words of the great philosophers, the Rolling Stones, I don't get no satisfaction. From bread alone, you're not going to get satisfaction. You may be physically satisfied, but we need more than that. And that's what the Torah tells us. But we live by that which proceeds from the mouth of God, meaning His will, His blessings, and His desire that you should live. Now, bread also is a symbol of blessing. Again, Deuteronomy 8, same chapter, verse 9, 10, etc. It tells us the land of Israel is famously blessed with a number of species. It says a land of Eretz Chita, Uso'ora, Gefen, Ute'ena, Verimon, a land of wheat, barley, grapevines, fig trees, pomegranates, Eretz, Zait, Shemen, Udvash, a land of olive oil and honey. So these are the 7 famous species of the land of Israel, which indeed do grow in Israel, wild. They grow in the wild in Israel, and of course have been cultivated for generations. Just by the way, in terms of these species in Israel, wine, one of the central grapes, which Israel was famous for wine. It was one of the symbols of blessing used in the prophets when they refer to prosperity, peace, and wealth in the land of Israel. The prophets use the term ish tachat gefano, each person under his vine, under his grapevine, sitting under your grapevine, drinking your Cabernet Sauvignon that was made in Israel. That was a symbol of prosperity and blessing. Of course, for 2,000 years, from the time the Jews were exiled after the destruction of the temple by the Romans, no one was producing wine. It wasn't until the late 19th century when the Baron Rothschild established a winery, vineyards in Rishon LeZion, that Jews started to produce wine again in Israel. And of course now the wine industry has exploded and become very, very prosperous and widespread in Israel. Israel producing an incredible variety of wines. But anyway, I mention this because this is just a great story which I have to interject with. That when Baron Rothschild produced their first batch of wine in Israel, produced by Jews, first time in 2,000 years, they sent bottles to famous Jews around the world. And a bottle was sent to Volozhin, which is in Belarus, and it was sent to Rabbi Chaim, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin was the head of the Volozhin Yeshiva, and he was a major supporter of Jewish settlement in the land of Israel, major supporter of the new nascent religious Zionist movement, and in appreciation, Rothschild sent him either a crate or a bottle of wine. And when Rabbi Berlin heard that there was wine from Israel that had arrived at the house, he put on his Shabbat clothing in order to greet it. When he held the wine in his hand and saw the label in Hebrew, and he saw made in Eretz Yisrael, made in the land of Israel, and he saw this is wine produced by Jews in the land of Israel, first time 2,000, he started crying. Unbelievable. Anyway, Israel is blessed with all these 7 species. And it goes on to say, the Torah goes on, Eretz, asher lo b'miskenut tochal ba lechem, a land in which you will not eat bread in poverty, some translate it as you will not eat bread in rations. Bread will be plentiful in the land of Israel. A land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you shall dig bronze. And then it goes on to say, after talking about you'll eat bread in a plentiful way in Israel, it gives us the famous verse, which is the obligation, the mitzvah, the obligation to actually say grace after meals, to thank God for the food, where it says, Ve'achalta, ve'savata, uverachta, you shall eat, and be satiated, uverachta, and then you shall bless et Hashem Elokecha, the Lord your God, al aretz hatova asher natan lach, on the good land that he gave you. And of course, this is the origin of our saying a special blessing after we eat a meal with bread. But notice, because of the context, we only say this lengthy bracha, this lengthy blessing called Birkat HaMazon, only after bread, because that is the context of the verses here. In Israel, you'll eat bread in plenty, and when you do eat and you are satiated, you shall say a blessing. So it's interesting to note, first of all, bread described as Adam's food. Bread, you shall toil for bread. Secondly, the bread is described as the source of life, at least physical life. And then it says, not by bread alone shall you live. And now we have a little bit further, bread is described as the symbol of blessing, of satiation and plenty. In the land of Israel you shall eat bread. And, of course, we have the very special mitzvah, one of the 613 commandments, to say a special blessing after we have had a meal with bread, which is called Birkat HaMazon. In Yiddish, it's called benching, because to bench is to bless. So it's blessing, basically. Not to be confused with the benching and that's it. Okay. Anyway, now also we move a little further along to Tehillim, Psalms 104. King David in Psalms writes about nature. One of the things he writes in this particular section, 104, very, very beautiful psalm, all about the wonders of nature and the wonders of the world. And there he says, Mashke harim ma'aliyosav mipri pa'asecha tizba haaretz, which is God waters the mountains from a high up, and the land is satiated from the fruit of God's actions. Matzmiach chatzir libehema, he grows grasses for the animals. Ve'esev la'avodas ha'adam, and further plants la'avodas ha'adam for the service of man. Lahotzi lechem min haaretz, to bring bread out of the ground. And he goes on to say, Yayin yisamach levav enosh, wine gladdens the heart of people. Lahatzil panim mishamen, oil makes the face shine. Velechem, and bread, levav enosh yisad, satiates and strengthens the heart of man. So King David mentioning bread here twice. He says that the plants that grow, meaning wheat, barley, rye, spelt, oats, etc., so the person can bring lahotzi lechem in aretz, to bring bread out of the ground. And then he says, just as wine gladdens and rejoices the heart, and oil makes the face shine, so bread strengthens the heart of the human being. So we have a lot of praises for bread. And from a halachic perspective, from a Jewish legal perspective, if you have a look at Code of Jewish Law 274, which I've quoted here, the Code of Jewish Law is talking about the meals on Shabbat. As you might know, on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, you're supposed to eat 3 meals. At night, Friday night, Shabbat lunchtime, and in the afternoon. The 2 main meals are Friday night and Shabbat lunch. And as you might guess, in Jewish tradition, there are laws and customs and rituals surrounding these meals. So we say Kiddush over wine, and we sing beautiful songs, and there are special foods that we have. But here it says the following: Su'udazu shel shacharit, this meal in the morning, efshar la'asotam b'li pat, you cannot do it without bread. You have to have bread at that meal. And of course, as we know, Jewish communities around the world have special types of bread. There is challah and many different versions of challah, but it's bread that is designed to be eaten at the Shabbat table. We usually have 2 loaves to remind us of the man in the desert, which a double portion fell on Friday. So you could pick up twice what you need, so you'd have for Friday and for Shabbat, because you wouldn't go out collecting man on the Shabbat. So we have 2 loaves. Every meal we have 2 loaves, and it's challah. So it's very common. A lot of people make the challah in a braid. It is. I can't do braids. Can you see that? That's a braid. I don't know if you picked that up, but okay. So we braid it. One of the reasons is because there are 2 commandments regarding Shabbat. Zachor, remember the Shabbat day, honor it, sanctify it, say words to discuss it, and so on and so forth. There's another command, shamor, guard the Sabbath day, which means don't do work, don't transgress. And both of those, the positive, which is remember, and the negative, which is guard it, are intertwined. and both of those observances come together. And so therefore we have a loaf of bread which is braided and intertwined to symbolize that. And challah is eaten at every meal. And if you look in the next source, which is the Biur Halacha, Biur Halacha means clarification of the law, which was a book written by the great Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan, who lived in Radun, also beginning of the 20th century. And he writes the following: bread must be eaten at the first two first meals of Shabbat, according to all opinions. And he gives an interesting reason. He says, as the verse states, you shall call the Shabbat a delight, oneg. It's Isaiah. And he says, there is no oneg, no delight without bread. And in the Tosfot of Rabbi Yehuda on Tractate Brachot, which is what we're looking at here, it states that the same is true for the festivals. On the festivals, it says simcha. You have a requirement of joy, and there is no joy, simcha, without bread. So it's interesting, from the Code of Jewish Law and the Biur Halacha, we see that a meal is really only an important meal, a meal which is joyful, a meal which is happy, and a meal which is of some importance only if there's bread. And we actually know that it is customary, and some say obligatory, that, for example, when we have what's called Udas Mitzvah, Udas Mitzvah means a meal which is a mitzvah you have to have. For example, that at a Brit Milah, when we are celebrating the circumcision, we're supposed to have a meal, bread, supposed to be eaten that meal. At a wedding, we celebrate at the wedding with a special festive meal, and for the week afterwards, we celebrate with a festive meal. Again, you're supposed to have bread. So bread crops up again, excuse the pun, but bread does crop up again and again and again, and whether it's with Adam, whether it is with the Jews in the desert, whether it is the blessing of the land of Israel, in terms of the obligation to have the meals on Shabbat, in terms of virtually every meal, and in terms of the obligation of Birkat HaMazon, grace after meals, again, only with bread. You could gorge yourself with sushi. I would not recommend it. But if you did, you would say a short blessing afterwards. You would not say the full Birkat HaMazon, grace after meals. You could have a full Chinese banquet. If you didn't have bread, it's not considered an important meal. So bread, very, very important. And what I'd like to understand is, why is it so? What's so significant about bread? Why do we make such a big deal about it? And not just Jews, but why does the world make a big deal? So I think the key is in a Gemara, the Talmud, in Tractate Sahim, which is on the next screen. The Talmud says the following, Sahim 118a. Very interesting exchange. It says the following, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, B'sha'ah sha'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'adam, kotz v'dardar tatzmiach lacha. When God said to Adam, thorns and thistles shall grow, and you'll eat the grass of the land, zalgu einav dma'ot, Adam started to cry. And he said, Amar lefanav, he said before God, he said, Ani v'chamori nachal meve'evus echad, shall I and my donkey eat from the same trough? And then God said, no, he said the following, when God said, no, Bezayat apecha tochalechem, you'll have to work for it. You'll have to sweat, blood, sweat, and tears to get your bread. But when God said that, nikarara da'ato, he was put at ease. Very interesting exchange. So God tells Adam that you're no longer going to be primarily eating the fruit of the tree. You are now going to be eating the grasses or the herbs of the ground, grains, vegetables, etc. So Adam is very upset. He starts crying. He says, my donkey and I are going to eat from the same trough? That's terrible. There's nothing to distinguish me from my donkey. And God says, no, you'll have to work hard and you'll have to transform the wheat into bread. But when God said that, you'll have to work hard and transform it into bread, Adam became at ease. He was happy. He was comforted. I think that this piece of Gemara is the key to the importance of bread and why bread is considered the quintessentially human food. Maharal, on the next source, in Netivot Olam, chapter 17, says the Netivot Havodah, chapter 17, says the following. He says, food which is readily available, food which is just you pick up and eat it, as animals do, that requires no preparation, does not distinguish between the human and the animal. He says, however, the human is unique. We have an incredible intelligence, we have creativity, we have an amazing ability to change the world, we have an amazing ability to transform things, to harness the energy in creation, whether it's through fire, electricity, nuclear energy. It's an amazing power that the human being has. And bread, he says, symbolizes, it's the food that symbolizes that power, uniqueness, and distinction of the human being. Because just to graze on wheat in the field, to take a stalk wheat and eat it, that is an animal. An animal could do that. I have nothing against animals. But that's what an animal can do. A human, however, to take that wheat and put it through all the processes and turn it into something and bake it and so on, turn it into something like bread, delicious bread, that is something which symbolizes the power of the human being. And he says, anytime you have something which is uniquely human, that must come from the uniquely human soul and the uniquely human intellect. And hence, bread, Adam, when he was told by God that he'll eat from the grains of the field, he was upset. He says, so that means I'm just going to be having ready to eat foods, just like an animal. God says, no. You'll have to work for it. You'll have to work hard for it. But when God tells Adam that idea, he's happy. Because the greatest gift God gave us and gave Adam is the ability to actually work, the ability to transform, the ability to create, and the ability to apply ourselves. So that's why Adam was happy. Because now when he eats bread, he's eating something which is distinctly, uniquely human. There are animals that kill other animals and eat them, lions, killing impala. There are animals that just swallow the other animal alive, whales eating plankton, algae, prawns, shrimp, etc. Right? Standard practice. Birds eating worms, standard. There are animals that eat vegetables and they just walk around grazing, whether it's cows or goats or llama, vicuna, alpaca, etc., etc. And there are even animals that sometimes break apart things. There's an Australian bird which throws a stone on other eggs of other animals and eats the inside. Okay, minor preparation. But there's no animal that takes the egg, cracks it open in a pan, fries it, dips bread in it, makes French toast. No such thing. No animals use fire, except for the human being uses fire, as is explicit in the great philosophical work Jungle Book and Mowgli. Right? But it is through the use of that intelligence that we produce bread. And consequently, that's why in all the sources that I showed you, in all the sources that we saw together, we see the greatness of bread, and we see it as something that represents that human power. That's why it's only on bread that we say that lengthy blessing. We say blessings on other food, and it's only bread which really makes the meal an important meal, because that's a meal in which you've got the quintessentially human food, the human food par excellence: bread, lavash, pita, laffa, baguette, bagel, rye, whole wheat, wonder bread, challah, tortilla, naan, roti, and so on and so forth, because all that is the bread in which the human takes pride, because we understand that in that we, like God, are creators. We take the raw material of the world, we turn it into something better. And of course, that's supposed to be a lesson for us about self-creation. We're supposed to make the raw material of self and improve upon that and turn that into something better, turn that into something superior, turn that into something more moral, ethical, spiritual, mindful, and aware. So it's a little bit of an introduction to bread in Judaism. Obviously, from an anthropological and historical perspective, there's a lot more to be said in terms of different customs of bread and different types of bread that Jews have eaten throughout the centuries. But the basic idea is always the same. Bread is human food, because that is something which needed intellect, creativity, power, and uniquely shows that ability of the human being to change the world. So that's a little bit of an introduction. If you would like to look at my book, Gateway to Judaism, Amazon, artscroll.com, etc. I do actually have a chapter there about food, blessings, etc. So you can see a full discussion of this there with other sources. And thank you very much for watching. This is Mordechai Becher with Jewish Broadcasting Service, Dimensions of the Daf.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.